agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how you doing?
I got nothing this morning. I'm sorry.
That's kind of how I feel. I've got nothing this morning as well. But anyway, before we do get going with what we do have, we'd like to thank our newest Patreon supporters, Jesus and James. Thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it. When you're a supporter, of course, you get that second full-length episode every week and ad-free versions of all our episodes and other things at various levels of support. To check it all out, patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you would like that bonus show and you can't afford at this point to support the show, totally understandable. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you all set up. And as always, if a monthly pledge is too much of a commitment, there's also Patreon and also now Venmo. We're at Politics Guys. You can find all that on the website. All right, so Jake, before we get to what we will be talking about today, I felt like I should say something about what we won't be talking about today, which is sort of, there's a lot we won't be talking about.
There's a lot of things.
Yeah, but two things in particular. I think like a lot of Americans, I've been following the Derek Chauvin trial, but, that's still at a point where I'm sure we will be talking about it when there is a verdict. But at this point, it seems, I think, a little premature to talk about it, but we will, again, be talking about it when there's a verdict. I'm sure we will. And then secondly, the Matt Gaetz allegations, and there's all kinds of stuff there, and I am itching to talk about that, and just have to hold myself back because he's one of those people who represents to me almost everything that is wrong about politics these days. And I don't get the sense that you're a fan of the Matt Gaetz fan club
Perhaps
either.
Everything that's wrong about humanity, but
yeah, exactly. He seems like an odious human being, but again, we have to give him that presumption of innocence. You can be an icky person and still get that presumption. In fact, it's most important for icky human beings, I would argue. But depending on what happens there, because, of course, while there are allegations, there has not been anything confirmed about an investigation from official sources. And also there hasn't been anything like an indictment. And if that does happen, we'll talk about it. But we're not really going to get into rumors at this point or, that kind of thing. And I think
Right.
You agree with me on that.
I do. That's the responsible way to go.
All right. Well, every once in a while we like to try that and see what happens. So, but why don't I just kind of turn things over to you then for the things that we actually will be talking about this week?
Right. Well, first off is the Biden infrastructure plan. He announced this last week. It totals $2.3 trillion. That's with a T. And it breaks down like this, essentially $600 billion. I'm using kind of rounded off numbers, Mike. $620 billion for transportation infrastructure, $174 billion for electric vehicle subsidies. This would also include 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations throughout the country. Roughly $286 billion for building repair. $300 billion for, this is the interesting one, I think, is semiconductor tech. I guess the way that we phrase it as business development, but a lot of it to support a U.S. semiconductor industry. And then some other, there's
a lot in there.
$440 billion clean energy. I could go on, Mike, but you get the gist. The plan would be paid for, and again, these specifics haven't been ironed out. But by moving the corporate tax from 21% up to 28%, this is essentially reversal of the Trump tax reform as to corporate taxes. There would also be some form of higher income, personal income tax. The number Biden floats is $400,000 a year. It's unclear if that's per person or per couple, or exactly how it's going to play out. But in Biden's words, this is not a plan that trifles around the edges.
That's for sure.
So, where do we go here? I think, and I should add that at this point, Republicans are fairly unanimous in opposing this as being overly big and not particularly targeted or targeted the wrong place. But
yeah, I think Mitch McConnell said something about it basically being the socialist radical, agenda kind of thing, turn us into Finland, or I don't know, Finland or anything. But I think we can both agree that this plan definitely doesn't trifle around the edges. So let's start with that. And to me, I looked through all of the various categories you talked about, did some of my own calculations, and it seems to me that of all this spending, I would say that around actually a bit under a third of it is what I would call real infrastructure or traditional infrastructure spending. And the rest of the stuff is sort of like infrastructure in quotes, if you will.
Yes.
But I would also say that in making that calculation, for instance, I considered the electric grid and broadband to be part of real infrastructure. That's not traditional infrastructure, which is just kind of like roads and bridges and electric and ports and that sort of thing. But I think you would probably agree with me that in 2021, broadband would be real infrastructure at this point.
Yeah, no, I would. I should have mentioned that because that is something that's a little different than what we think of in terms of roads and bridges and so forth.
$100 billion. That's certainly not nothing, right? And it reminded me. There were some of the current suppliers saying, well, people don't really need that kind of access and that sort of thing. And, that's overkill. And it reminded me of Bill Gates. This might be apocryphal saying in 1981 that 640K of memory should be enough for anyone. And, at the time, that sort of thing is true, but you build infrastructure for the economy you're envisioning in the future. And, we can certainly see a future with, holographic virtual meetings and that sort of thing. And having that kind of fiber access would be pretty important for that sort of thing. It's probably on my mind because this week we actually switched from kind of copper cable to high speed fiber. And wow, talk about a difference, really eye opening. But I think it's fair to say, as many Republicans say, that, well, this is much more than an infrastructure bill, and they're stretching the idea of infrastructure beyond what's reasonably considered infrastructure. And I would agree with that, actually. But to me, that's because of the politics of this. And the politics of this is pretty straightforward. I think the Biden administration and Democrats in Congress think that they will, before the midterms, they will be able to get through 3 pieces of legislation, all under reconciliation, because they can only do basically 3 reconciliation bills. And they already have that. The first one's been done. That was COVID. The second one is infrastructure in quotes, part 1. And the third one is infrastructure in real quotes, part 2, which is coming up. And so that's their calculation. They want to call it infrastructure. And a big part of it certainly is infrastructure, at least in this bill. And so the political calculation makes sense, but I would agree that calling it an infrastructure bill when the majority of it is not traditional infrastructure, that is a stretch. Yeah,
well, and it's sort of it's not unexpected though, right?
No.
I mean, there is broad public support when you say something like, "Hey, are you in favor of infrastructure?" Everybody says, "Sure," and that's something that can typically be bipartisan.
And not only that, but I mean, we definitely have a serious situation when it comes to infrastructure. For instance, since 2007, total public spending on infrastructure down by around $10 billion. And right now, the United States spends right around 2.3% of GDP on infrastructure. To give you a sense of where that kind of stands, well, China's infrastructure spending is around 10 times higher than in the U.S. And if you kind of take a look at some international comparisons, we're not doing such a great job. And a lot of our infrastructure, of course, is pretty old. I think that's part of the reason for the bipartisan agreement. There's a very clear need for this sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right in terms of the roads and bridges type arguments. it gets a little tougher when you get to 174 billion to for electric vehicles, right? I mean, that is more a that is more a subsidy to industry. That is a check to Elon Musk, essentially, and based on the what I would refer to as kind of the pretty unscientific notion that this will help with climate change. That I think, I think Republicans would be able to take aim at going into this. But
Well,
I think
yeah,
the problem is there's not going to be. I don't think there's going to be much compromise on this,
I think
right? You don't have the
I
numbers.
would entirely disagree with the idea that it's unscientific to say that electric vehicles aren't a major component of climate change, or at least helping to mitigate the effects. But that's a very different conversation. But I did want to say that because I'm sure that some listeners would say, why is it that you let Jay get away with saying that? I'll just
away with
point out
that.
that I completely disagree with that, but that's a very different conversation. And when there is, when we're talking more specifically about climate change legislation, I'm sure we'll get into that. But
All right.
but yeah, but another part. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say another part of this is when we take a look at how we traditionally fund infrastructure, one big part of it is the federal gas tax. And that's right now it's at 18.4 cents per gallon for regular, 24.4 for diesel. That hasn't been raised in over a quarter of a century, and it's not indexed for inflation. And that's a big problem. That's part of the reason why our infrastructure is in such, at least roads, is in such bad shape. But another problem that a lot of folks have with it, especially on the left, is it's not an ideal way to raise funds because it's not only is it regressive, but it hurts rural drivers more who have to go longer distances. And so it's a problematic way to pay for road improvements. But even that problematic way hasn't been increased in a lot of years.
Well, the problem it's problematic for the left because they're sort of looking at a tax base that they want to eliminate, right? I mean, that's the other thing, right? If you're going to have more and more electric vehicles, you can expect that, and you want to pay for that with gas tax, at least partially. You sort of have a diminishing tax base if you're successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And as cars get more fuel efficient, that becomes, that's not really a direction that is going to provide the sort of funding you need over time because of the switch from gas to electric vehicles. And yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say another problem with this legislation is because it has to go through the reconciliation process. One of the rules of reconciliation is that anything that qualifies can't be projected to increase the deficit after 10 years. And that becomes hugely problematic because I definitely want to talk about the tax hike part of it. Now, in 2017, the Republican tax cuts lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. And I think a lot of people agreed that 35% was too high. And I was one of those people who agreed with that. Now, under the Biden proposal, it would raise it up to 28%. So still lower than it was pre-2017, but higher than it is now. And to give people a sense of where that stands, the average corporate tax rate for the G7 countries, the 7 largest economies, essentially is 27.24%. Right now, the U.S. at 21% is the second lowest. If you want to compare us to China and India, to other huge economies, China's corporate tax rate is 25%. India is 25%. And to me, actually, I think 25% would be a pretty good level to set this at. I'm for boosting that rate. I think that the 2017 cuts went too low, but I think 28% is too high. But again, there's that problem with reconciliation because if you don't take that in higher corporate taxes or some way, well, that means you're going to have to borrow more, and then that could potentially violate the reconciliation rules, which is why I hate the reconciliation process in the first place.
Right.
So, but what do you think? I wanted to ask you what you thought about the tax increase part, and what you think about where we are internationally in our corporate taxes.
I think if you look back at the Trump tax reforms and Trump tax cuts, if you want to call them that, it's, and you and I agreed on this back in the day. cutting the corporate tax to prevent corporate inversions, to prevent companies from fleeing the U.S., was a smart policy, and it had some pretty substantial results. That you had a lot of companies that came back to America. You had a lot of cash that had been kept offshore, because if they brought the cash back, I mean, they could still hold the money in overseas subsidiaries, but if they repatriated it, then you got taxed on it. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but it's in the terms of trillions of dollars, right? Of money that flowed back into the U.S. economy.
Actually, that's not the case.
That's not the case at all. Okay, tell me what is the case?
No, I'm saying there were benefits, but I'm saying that the loss in revenue was not nearly paid for by the cuts, as many Republicans claimed it would at the time. But economists on both the right and the left.
That's not what I'm claiming.
It sounded like you said trillions came in, but actually it lost more in lost revenue, and maybe that's okay if you want less money coming in. I just wanted to make sure that
where you misunderstand me. Trillions coming into the United States, to United States companies, right? That had not the U.S. government.
I see what you're saying.
Money that had formerly been parked offshore because you didn't want to be taxed on it. Now companies could bring those profits back, and it wasn't money going to the government; it was going to companies. But they used it to do things like hire people, improve their operations, and in many cases, as the numbers showed, increase wages. So, and to me, that's you can say, well, look, it's a loss because we're not getting as much tax revenue as we used to. Well, yes and no, but are more people being employed? Are more people making money? Are stock prices going up? All these other things where there is money accruing to Americans, and I think it's a bigger thing of money accruing to actual people than as opposed to the government. So that's what I meant by trillions coming back.
But just to be clear, you would not be in favor of, for instance, a corporate tax rate of 0%.
No, I think that would be over the top. And I think, look, taxes are the price we pay for civilization, right? It's what Oliver Wendell Holmes said. But you don't want to overpay for civilization.
No, I agree. Yeah, I certainly agree. I mean, there are some radical proposals, legitimately radical, not in political terms, legitimately radical proposals about, a corporate tax rate of 50% or 0%, and neither of us are there. So I think that, I might say that 25% seems good to me. You might say that the current 21% is okay, but neither of us is talking about anything crazy, essentially.
Right. I mean, to me, the other thing that one of the big factors you have to look at is where's everybody else, and what are the chances that companies will pick up and move.
Exactly. And that's where I got 25
that's
from.
What the big problem we had. And your sense is that magic number is somewhere around 25, that for that extra 4% that you might get in Ireland, it's not worth making the move. And that may be the case. It may not be the case. We'll just have to wait and see.
Well, I think another factor is you have to look at the cost of borrowing, because right now interest rates, I think for 10-year treasuries, around 1.6%, which is by historical standards just insanely low. And so then I think when interest rates are that low, you have to think, does it make more sense to borrow that money instead of increase taxes? Because if you assume that the economic growth from these investments that we're borrowing for is greater than 1.6%, well, then it would be dumb not to borrow the money, right? I mean, and I think you could possibly make that case that depending on what we're investing the money in, that the potential economic growth could essentially even that out, and it would make more sense to pay for certain infrastructure projects through borrowing than for raising taxes.
I would say, yeah, that's a possibility. What you always run into is the growth from that government investment, what you think it's going to be.
Yeah.
Right. And then we look back to 2008 and all the shovel-ready projects and so forth. And what you ended up with was Solyndra.
And to be fair,
I know that's simplifying it. But look, the shovel ready product and so forth weren't there. They just,
Well, there's no such
was
thing. I mean, there's just
yeah.
yeah. I hate that term because it's misleading, right? Shovel ready means if you're lucky 6 months, and that would be incredibly quick. And so I think when we're talking about
years,
so when we're talking about infrastructure spending, we're not talking about short-term economic stimulus. This is stuff where we're looking down the road a decade or 2 decades or something like that. And certainly in terms of startup, a year or more. So for short-term economic stimulus, infrastructure is not really the way to go. I think you would agree with me.
Yeah.
But what do you think in general? I mean, are there parts of this that you like? Because obviously, if you were in the Senate, you would vote against this because you would say it's too much and it raises taxes too much to pay for it. But are there parts of it that you think are a good idea?
Yeah, no, like I'm okay with a lot of this transportation infrastructure to the extent that we're talking about fixing roads and fixing bridges. I think the broadband expansion is good and helpful, and that is the kind of investment that will benefit. You'll see benefits across the board for a whole lot of people, a whole lot of industries. So that I'm okay with. Some of the building fix-ups that will make buildings more energy efficient. Yeah, I'm okay with all that. Do we need 286 billion? I don't know. I couldn't tell you for sure. That seems high, but those categories are things I think that make sense and are things that typically you have bipartisan support for. I'm more concerned with the things that seem to be, for again the 300 billion that seems to be, for semiconductors and that seem industry targeted, right? That strike me as much more as this is a that's pretty swampy, right? It's government picking winners and losers, and those are the ones that I have the bigger issues with.
So then, on that particular issue, government picking winners and losers, then you obviously would not. I mean, you mentioned you're not crazy about for instance, subsidies for electric vehicles and that sort of thing. Then, by the same token, you might actually be okay with removing the subsidies for fossil fuel companies. I mean,
sure,
same,
yeah.
So I think that's
I've been there for a while. Yeah,
absolutely. I just wanted to point it out because I knew that's where you were, and so I thought that's important to point out that you are consistent on that issue. I get where you're coming from on that because the tax code is all about government picking winners and losers or trying to promote certain behaviors and discourage others. And to a certain extent, I think that's inevitable and okay, but it certainly can go too far. I think it's oversimplifying to say government should never do that and can never do that. But that's sort of a extreme libertarian type of position, which I don't think.
Well, and also I think it does come back to this is a more meta kind of view of it.
Yeah.
But in terms of trust in government and so forth, and just the general honesty of are these things infrastructure? Some of them are, but a lot of it isn't, and I think that's some people just bristle like me, and I think to some extent you.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. In a better world, what's happening here is that the process is dictating the substance, and I hate that. That's totally backwards, right? I mean. In a better world, this would be probably 3 or 4 or maybe even half a dozen separate smaller bills that would be digestible and focused on one topic. But that's not how legislation works anymore these days. And it's because of the process, it's because of this ridiculous reconciliation thing. It's because of the polarization that we get these massive mega bills that I think, both of us agree are not really the way governing should happen.
Yeah, but here's the thing: if these were broken up into smaller pieces, look, I think Biden could get the 10 Republican votes he needs for the bridges and roads. I think he could get the 10 Republican votes he needs for the broadband. All those things, but it's not to anyone's political advantage to play it that way at this point.
Yeah, I think he could maybe get 4 or 5, but I do not think he could get 10 senators to go on. I think that the incentives are too great given how close the Senate is. They're too great to just say, we're not going to give the other party any sort of victory. We're going to stand together. And yeah, you have your Mitt Romneys and your Susan Collinses, and their brand sort of is a little bit of independence. But I don't think there are 10 people, 10 Republicans. I don't know that there'd be 10
Not for
Democrats.
the whole package, but I'm saying I think you could get 10 for breaking it into pieces.
Yeah, I disagree. You're usually the cynic, right? I would say you're the one being the much more optimistic here. I don't think that's the case, and I think that's why they're doing it. That's why they're doing it that way. But I do believe that this will pass in some way, shape, or form. I think there will be some significant changes. It won't end up being as big because there are a few centrist Democrats that have to be convinced, but there will be an infrastructure bill that will pass. Would you agree with that? You think that's going to happen?
No, absolutely. There will. Yeah, something's going to pass.
And there's going to be a lot of good stuff in it. So there you go.
Yeah, and bad stuff.
All right. So, yeah.
So, no, moving on.
Well, but before we do move on, Jay, let's just take 1 minute for a quick break, and then we will come back and talk about the reaction to the Georgia voter law.
So our next story is the reaction to Georgia's changes in its voting law. Just yesterday, Major League Baseball announced that it will not be having the All-Star game in Atlanta. Also, CEOs of Coca-Cola and Delta have made statements saying that the voting law, which, let's be clear, expands voting, is inconsistent with their does not match Delta's values. It's unacceptable. This follows Joe Biden going on ESPN about a week ago saying that this voting bill, which again expands voting, was Jim Crow on steroids, and says, look, you can't vote after 5 o'clock, which was the Washington Post awarded a 4 Pinocchios, usually reserved to Trump, for that statement. So, I think, Mike, I said a couple weeks ago, we were talking about this woke corporatism and so forth. And I think I said something to the effect that corporations will always roll over. And I think I'm getting borne out here.
Well, I'll say two things in reaction to that. First, while it is correct, as you pointed out, to say that the law expands voting, it expands it in person at the polls voting, but it actually does restrict other types of voting. So it's sort of a mixed bag, but it is fair.
Let me just add in on that. Something else that it does is that it authorized voting drop boxes, which for the first time. You can vote and drop it off at drop boxes at boards of elections 3 weeks before. It had no cause mail voting. The big sticking point was requiring signatures on these mail-in ballots. Anyway, this is something I am kind of passionate about, because I think it's sort of the height of demagoguery that Biden and a lot of the folks on the left have gone around saying this is Jim Crow, when it absolutely positively isn't.
Well,
and really trying to raise up racial tensions and tell folks that people are trying to steal your vote. I think that's abominable.
I think certainly there's an element of hyperbole, but for instance, on the Dropbox thing, the provision in there, while it does allow for at least one Dropbox, it also limits them to the extent, in large urban areas. For instance, under the new rules, Fulton County, which is the county that contains the Atlanta metro area, under these new rules, they go from the 38 drop boxes they had in the last election to 8 in future elections. That's a big change. Or the other rule that really focused on Fulton County, not by name, but that said that they cannot have the mobile voting van or vehicle, basically. And there's no indication that is at all unsafe. So there are a number of provisions.
But how's that racist?
Because it targets large urban minority population areas. That's how it's seen as being racist. Now, I'm not
Again,
saying
how is it racist? That's what
because when you
that's
make it
what Trump is
harder,
saying.
when you create legislation that seems to make it more difficult for largely minority population areas to vote, that's going to be seen as racist, even if the intent is really just to make it more Republican voting, because of course there's a strong correlation between race, at least in terms of black voters and support for the Democratic Party. And so even if I'm willing to give most Georgia legislators the benefit of the doubt and say they're not doing this for racist motives, and I can't look into their hearts. Obviously, I can say I feel confident in saying that
Well,
they are doing
apparently,
it for
like a whole lot
partisan
of other
motives.
people have the confidence that they can look into their hearts,
Well,
right? I mean, the president is yeah.
I know that I can't. Certainly, I believe that there are races in the world, and I know that some of them serve in legislatures, and some of them are probably governors, and some may even be presidents of the United States at times. But I think that it's pretty clear that this ends up creating more difficulties for large urban areas that actually provided the margin of victory for instance, Joe Biden in 2020 or the two Georgia senators who won in the runoff election. So it's hard not to connect those dots when all of this seems to happen so closely together, especially. And so that's how I think people reach that conclusion. And it's not an unreasonable conclusion to reach in my mind.
So I guess where are you then on corporations weighing into this?
Well,
and that's because that's the second piece of this, and to me, almost the more problematic.
I think that's I think it's telling that when this actually was going through the process, these corporations were silent. They said they were doing stuff behind the scenes and so forth. But
well, in some cases, they were actually applauded it.
Yeah. So, this after the fact thing is clearly a response to, pressure from various groups. And I don't see it as rolling over. I see it as just, a PR kind of covering their backsides effort. They want to appeal to everyone. They certainly were concerned about, to a certain extent, I think, what the legislature could do to them. At least some of them were saying that.
Right.
But so, I don't think it's rolling
that's
over.
rolling
because
over. And that I think is
how is it rolling over? It's making a statement that's going to have no effect on the actual legislation. It's not like the Georgia legislature is going to say, "Oh, Coca-Cola and the Atlanta Falcons and these other Delta, they don't like this. Well, let's change the law."
Yeah, no. I think you're missing the game here.
Okay.
The game isn't Georgia. The game is House Bill 1 and the filibuster.
Well, I'm okay with that.
This is why, and to me, this is why the president and Democrats have made such a big deal about Georgia, is they need an issue to nuke the filibuster, and they want to be able to claim that states are rolling back voting rights. This is Jim Crow on steroids, which again, those type of statements I think are so patently false. And you go on TV and say, I think Major League Baseball should pull the All-Star game. The president of the United States says this.
I agree.
And then MLB says, you're okay.
I'm going to say I agree, especially because, again, under the argument or the scenario I sketched out, which it seems to me that this law, while you're right in terms of expanding voting in some areas, it seems to me it's a reasonable reading to say that it actually contracts it in some ways, especially in large minority population urban areas. And given that this year, Major League Baseball was going to be celebrating the career of Hank Aaron, who died this year and who faced horrific racism when he was on the verge of breaking Babe Ruth's home run record, doing so in a state where a number of people can reach, I believe, the reasonable conclusion that the state legislature has targeted Black populations, maybe not because they're Black per se, but because they vote for Democrats. Still, I think that's a reasonable stance. I applaud what Major League Baseball did, and like I said, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah, I love baseball, and this is, I mean, baseball's breaking my heart the last couple of years, but let's talk about that also in terms of the Georgia law is more permissive than New York's, right? It's more permissive, I believe, than Ohio's. If for the racism that Hank Aaron encountered, the racism of the people who fought for the Voting Rights Act, dogs and fire hoses encountered, and they fought and they voted, and now we're going to say that is worse than well, you have to sign your absentee ballot.
No, and I agree. Let me be clear. I agree with you totally on that. I agree that this is not worse than Jim Crow. But again, let's go back when
Well, let me just go a little bit further.
Okay.
For the purposes of a country that has been torn by these racial issues for the past year, I mean more than that, obviously, but come to the forefront in the last year. Isn't it sort of incumbent on leadership, both in the political world and in the business world, to not go around throwing gas on the fire?
But on the other hand,
isn't this that gas? And isn't that when Joe Biden says this, and these CEOs then say, yes, this is terrible, this is horrible, it's not in keeping with our values. Like Delta has values about how many drop boxes there are. I mean, and again, keep in mind that any mailbox is a drop box. You vote. I mean, again, to me, it just strikes me as this is over the top demagoguery. And if someone can point out to me how exactly this is racist, I would love to hear it, or how it's even close to anything that went on in the Jim Crow era. I'd like to hear it.
I agree that the hyperbole, there's hyperbole here. I certainly, if I were president of the United States, I would not have called it Jim Crow on steroids. I would have said something like that I was troubled by the ways in which it seems to restrict voting in those communities, just like I said a few minutes ago. But I also just want to, and maybe I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that during the Trump presidency, more than a few times, you endorsed the idea of taking Donald Trump seriously, but not literally. And you have to understand the hyperbole is just kind of how he does things. And I'm wondering if it seems to me that you're maybe much more upset when a Democratic president does it than when a Republican president, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I want to, and so maybe you can clarify that for me.
Well, two things. One, let's put it this way: if I was wrong about Donald Trump, then I suppose I'm right now. But the difference is that people are taking Biden seriously, and most people didn't take Trump seriously. For example, Biden is making these crazy hyperbole type statements, or lies might be another word, and you have major corporations acting on them. You have the entire, well, not the entire, but a large part of Congress pushing this narrative so that they have justification to try to override the filibuster rule. So I think that's the problem is people. It's not even a matter of taking him literally or seriously. If you just take Biden seriously, then what he's saying is a big problem. I guess the other issue, the difference, I guess I'd put between Trump and Biden is a lot of Trump stuff was sort of self-reflective, right? This is, look, I'm the best president ever. Many people are telling me this. This is the greatest plan ever. It's super. What the Democrats have, it's terrible. It's very bad. It's not of the same. It is what you call in the law puffery, right? That you can say things like, "Hey, this car is the best ever." It gets great mileage, but you can't lie about the actual numbers. In this case, look, and again, going back to the Joe Biden, you're not going to let you vote after 5 o'clock. That is out and out false. Now, maybe he was just confused, but.
Yeah, that was wrong, and we should call out lies. I agree, and certainly we don't want to get into a comparison of Biden's lies at this point for misstatements to Trump's.
We can even stipulate that Trump lied about all this stuff. And if you want to say I'm being hypocritical in calling Biden out now and not calling Trump out now, okay, fair enough. But that doesn't make Biden right.
No, and certainly I just wanted to get some clarification on that. So yeah, I was just wondering about that in particular. So like I said, I think that you're right in the sense that this is trying to send a message to, and there are other states that are looking to pass laws similar to this. I think Texas, Florida, I believe, some other states. And I think that is sending a message. And, I'm okay with that because I think that consumers and I think that corporations, they certainly have every right to express their views and to use their economic clout to try to enact social change. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I guess I'm wondering if you do.
Oh, my concern is when corporations begin to be essentially another arm of the government.
Well, how are they being another? I mean, they already are in terms of their camping financing and so forth. But
and I think you've got a point there. But to the extent that the government can enforce its will through corporate decisions, and then say, "Oh, hey, it's a private company; they can do what they want." But at the same time, they're saying, "Hey, nice company you got here. Hope nobody comes along and regulates it."
Right.
Which I point out is exactly what Elizabeth Warren said to Amazon last week. Right. It's sort of a piece here that Amazon tweets had been critical of her, and she tweeted back saying that she may use her power to break up companies so they wouldn't be powerful enough to heckle senators.
Yeah, that was ridiculous. Sure. Yeah.
But it's the same sort of thing of look, you haul in all these tech company folks before Congress and you browbeat them and say, look, we hear there's a lot of misinformation going on around there. You guys better knock it off or something might happen. And then you have companies that take steps to censor. Now again, I haven't seen any Facebook warnings on the Joe Biden statements about worse than Jim Crow or the 5 p.m. voting thing. It's apparently they've overlooked that. But when you do that, and then there says, "Hey, look, it's Zuckerberg's platform, his rules," that's problematic. When the government is essentially surreptitiously governing by bullying corporations, that's a big problem. And it used to be, I think, if these corporate CEOs had a backbone, they could say something like, "Listen, we'll leave the voting laws of Georgia to the people of Georgia."
But if you believe that corporations, just like individuals, have free speech rights,
well, they do.
You wouldn't want to say to them, "Well, you shouldn't be saying." I mean, you can maybe say, "I don't think it's wise," but you're not saying that they don't have the right to do that, or that they Major League Baseball.
No, absolutely, they have the right. I'm questioning how free is their speech, right? When you have, if they're speaking under compulsion of a government that says, "Hey, look, we'd really like you to issue some statements, viewing things our way, if you know what's good for you." Is that free speech?
Well, but in that sense, I mean, corporations, of course, they're ultimately designed to maximize profit, and so if they feel that they're getting pressure that's going to hurt sales, well, then they are going to respond in that. So in a sense, that speech is compelled, just like their product offerings are compelled, because their fundamental goal isn't to advance social justice; it's to sell airplane tickets or soft drinks or something like that. And so if they think that something is going to advance that interest, they'll do it. But on the other hand, if they feel like they're going to get too much blowback from, say, I don't know, like employing a very qualified quarterback who kneels during the national anthem, well, they won't do that. So, I don't see that there's much of an issue. Of course, it's compelled speech in that sense.
Well, the blowback, though, I think, in so much of the compulsion comes from political leaders who make these statements. Right? When AOC goes out and says, "Hey, boycott Goya beans," because their CEO accepted an award from Trump. That's something different, right? When you have the government involving itself and trying to stir up this type of
well, that's not the government, though. That's not legislation. That's not an executive order.
Joe Biden works for the government. Joe Biden went on ESPN
But
and
just
said,
well, yeah,
I
but
want Major League Baseball to pull the All-Star game.
and so you're saying that once you are an elected official, you can have no personal opinions or you can't express them. Your First
Sure,
Amendment rights are.
but don't you think? But doesn't it strike you as being overly? I mean, when in history have we had this of a president going and telling a company, "Look, I think you should move your whatever because I don't like a voting law of a particular state."
I mean, I'm not, and maybe not that specific example, but certainly President Trump said all kinds of things, made all kinds of threats to companies, and presidents do this kind of thing all the time. Political figures try to use their, bully pulpit to try to get things done that they can't necessarily do legislatively. And that's just how politics and power work. And there's nothing wrong with that. I don't see it as anything.
There is.
I totally disagree.
The idea
if AOC wants to say,
I will take official action against you. That's
different, though. That's a different thing. Official action is one thing, and just speaking as a human being, as a person, saying, I think this is what this group should do, though I will not in any way compel it. Why shouldn't we allow? I mean, why would you have a problem with that?
Here's a good question, though. Where can the All-Star game go? Because if they come to Ohio, for example, we only allow one drop box per county. That would seem to eliminate us. New York doesn't allow as many weeks for early voting. That ought to eliminate them. Plainly, as Jim Crow racists. This is why I think when you come down to this issue is so ridiculous in and of itself that it's demagoguery, right?
Well, I disagree. I don't think it's demagoguery. I think it's just, an attempt to try to move or to force change by various means that are not governmental action. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. That's sort of, the system at work, and I'm okay with that.
All right.
All right.
I will leave it. I will leave it, Mike, with my statement that I often make and repeat is, one day they'll come for you. But.
Right. Before we, Jay, get to our next story, we'll just take one more break and then we will be right back. Okay, Jay. So, with March Madness, the Final Four upon us, I thought it was sort of opportune, right, to talk about a case that the Supreme Court heard this week. Yeah.
So, and again, we'll say this differs a little bit from our typical practice of usually we don't hit real hard on Supreme Court cases until there's a decision to talk about. But in this case, the court heard arguments on NCAA versus Alston, which deals with whether or not colleges essentially could, whether, let me say this correctly, whether the NCAA could restrict eligibility and compensation for student athletes, and whether that violates federal antitrust laws, because it would bar athletes from receiving essentially fair market compensation for their labor. So now the Seth Waxman, who's represented the NCAA, argued that college sports have a distinct character that is different than that, and that colleges are essentially still educational institutions, and that's why amateurism is important, and that you can't compare this to offering pro athletes. So Clarence Thomas criticized him, saying that, listen, it's odd that you can say that this is really amateur sports, considering the amount of money that goes into them, both from the institutions themselves and the amount of money they generate in society generally. So, Mike, what are your thoughts? You are as a college professor, although you're not necessarily a athletic powerhouse at NKU.
It is
Although
a division.
NKU got in the tournament a couple years ago,
Yep,
right?
it is a Division One school.
Yeah,
But, right now, obviously, we're talking about this during the tournament that brings in somewhere around $800 million in revenue to the NCAA. And if you take a look at, for instance, the list of the highest paid public employee in every state, in something like 40 states,
the
it is
football coach.
football or basketball coach, right? So the NCAA has been hiding behind this sort of amateur student athlete sort of thing for a long time. And, in certain instances, it's true. As a professor, I've seen a lot of student athletes, and many of them actually are student athletes. But also, for a while, I got my, as you know, I got my PhD at the University of Kentucky. And for a while there, as a graduate assistant, I taught some classes, and I had some basketball players in classes. And that's a whole different world, certainly, basketball, say, at UK, as opposed to, say, track and field at Northern Kentucky University. And I think that it's interesting to see sort of the cross-cutting breakdown on this. For instance, you have Justice Kavanaugh saying the antitrust law shouldn't be a cover for exploitation of the student athletes, right? Or Justice Kagan saying that you have schools that have, the NCAA has this undisputed market power, and they're going to use it to fix athletic salaries at extremely low levels. And I think that's absolutely going on. And the NCAA is just saying, well, that's okay because they're amateurs. But the fact of the matter is these are kids who are putting in 30, 40, 50, 60 hours a week on their sport. These are kids who are being told to not take certain classes because they're too hard, or not take certain majors because they're too hard, and that are being carefully selected into certain classes and majors and programs with no real idea toward what they are interested in doing or their academic advancement, but what will best allow them to have the most time for their athletics. So to call them student athletes is always sort of rankled, at least especially in the big time football and basketball programs, because I think that's a sham, and I think the justices recognize that.
Yeah, and I think you're right that this is a weird case, and that there's no ideological breakdown on this. And I myself am, sort of torn, in that, part of me is a traditionalist, right? And you ought to think, and there's this idea that, look, colleges are for kids to get an education, and sports are essentially an extracurricular activity that is something that is meant to help broaden, students and give them an outlet and so forth. But the traditional view is you don't go to major in a sport, you go to major in some academic discipline. That conflicts with the other part of my brain that is pretty market oriented. That points out exactly as you did. Look, these kids are essentially college employees. They're working for the college. They're generating a whole lot of money for the college. Certainly, they're getting some support in some cases in terms of scholarship money. That depends on where you fall in the different college divisions and so forth. But yeah, is it fair that they're just not being paid?
And to be clear, this case is not about paying them a salary. It's about expanding their academic benefits. So it's not saying, well, they should get, money directly for this, although there are people who have...
They get it indirectly, yeah.
Yeah, there are people who have suggested that. For instance, Cory Booker has this college athlete Bill of Rights, which would include things like, in part, revenue sharing.
It's like it's got unionization and stuff, too.
Yeah, well, healthcare related to injuries and scholarships for the time needed to complete their degree. And I think when you think about what happens to a lot of these kids, especially the ones who are essentially majoring in their sport, especially the sports where they believe that they have the potential to have a future in, the NFL or the NBA, which are the two big ones where the, colleges are essentially a de facto minor leagues for that a lot of these kids are sort of used up and thrown away, and they don't get an education, and they end up with these injuries and so forth. And I think it's horrendous the way that that's done because there just aren't enough slots in the major leagues or in the NFL for these people. And so I do think they're being abused, and I think that's wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the issue turns then you go to the legal issue of, okay, does this violate the antitrust statutes? And that's a little, that gets even a little trickier, right? I mean, I think we can argue on the moral ground, policy ground, is the current situation necessarily an antitrust violation? I think that's what the court's gonna be looking at. I have no prediction at all how this is gonna come out, but
I feel like I think you probably agree that the best solution of this would be some sort of legislation as opposed to a court deciding this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is always my default position. Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me that the NCAA certainly is not jumping at the opportunity to craft some sort of alternative, right? Because they want to ideally keep on paying the athletes nothing and taking all this money in for themselves. But I think you can envision, at least for the two major sports, right, men's basketball and football, some sort of like a situation where you have a salary cap and basically like it's done in the professional sports, essentially, so that way smaller Division I schools can still compete with the larger schools, just like in the NFL, for instance, Green Bay can compete with New York because of those salary cap rules and things like that. And it's not crazy to envision a system like that for college athletes, I don't think.
Yes and no, but you're still not going to have. I mean, Baldwin Wallace is still not going to compete with Ohio State.
Well, because it's not Division I, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, you still have these divisions, but it's certainly you can see where where you don't want a situation where just a few schools are dominating everything, like the Ohio States of the world, because they have all of that massive, the amount of money they can offer, that sort of thing, which is the exact same reason why you have salary caps in baseball, so the Yankees can't get all of the best players every year, or the Lakers or what have you.
Yeah, I guess then my other concern is, I mean, to what extent is it worthwhile maintaining the fiction that colleges are really care about the education of these kids, right? I mean, that's sort of, I guess that.
And it's not just, I got to say, it's not just the football and basketball. That's where we think about it. But again, I've, as a professor, I've had plenty of students. I've been advisor to a number of students who were athletes in the non-prestige sports, tennis, track, like I said, that sort of thing. And the hours that they put in, their schedules are unreal between their training sessions and their time in the weight room and this other stuff. They're falling asleep in classes because it's just, and this is at, like I said, a Northern Kentucky University, a school that's not, we're not talking Ohio State or anything like that. It's a brutal schedule for these kids to keep up. And I don't think a lot of people who haven't been involved in some way in college athletics, Division I college athletics, realize what an incredible strain it is on these kids, just full stop, in any of these sports.
Yeah.
And that's the main thing, is we need to look at this not from the, I would say, the economic perspective, but what are we doing to these kids? Are we ensuring that they have the same opportunity to get an education that the non-athlete does? Which is why I would like to see a system where the scholarship in a way is not necessarily linked to the amount of time that they're playing the sport. So that way, if it takes you 6 or 7 years to get your degree because you were taking all this time to play a sport and you couldn't take a full load or something, that should be okay, I think. Right. Or there should be some sort of way to deal with that. You shouldn't have
but much more often you see the other way around, of the student leaves school to enter the pros early.
Yeah, well, at least some of them do, right?
Yeah,
I mean, most of them don't. Yeah, so and that's where I come off on this, is that there are just a lot of kids who are being fed a bill of goods, who are being mistreated, and that's not okay, and that should change.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on pretty much all those points.
Okay, well, Jay, we haven't done recommendations in a while. I thought it would be fun to kind of close out by doing that for the first time in a long time. What do you think?
Oh gosh, I don't know if I've got anything. Let me think. So you go first.
Okay. Well, I will. I will make. Well, I don't think I've recommended this before. It's hard, you get older, and it's like, did I say this before? Anyway, but my recommendation this week is a movie, an old movie called Network. I don't know if you've ever seen this, Jay. Network.
I have seen Network.
It could possibly be. What's right up there with Apocalypse Now as being maybe my favorite movie of all time. So maybe be a double recommendation. If you haven't seen either of those movies, my
Can I
gosh.
interrupt and say I watched Apocalypse Now last night? But go ahead.
Really? Did you?
It was on just a random sort of old movie channel.
It
But
is
go ahead.
definitely one of my favorite movies of all time. But Network, really, I show it whenever I can in classes because even though it's from 1976, it's prescient and it so speaks to today's world, even more so in some ways, about the craziness of media and the public, and it's just I won't even try to summarize it, but I see a lot of it, at least the positive aspects of the lead character, Howard Beale, in myself in some ways, not the insane parts of him, I hope, but it is a great movie. And I strongly recommend you check it out. It's well worth your time. So that's my recommendation. Network and also Apocalypse Now, which Jay just saw last night, apparently. So.
I should put the caveat. I fell asleep. I couldn't stay up for the whole thing.
I can still quote big parts of Apocalypse Now because I've seen it so many times anyway. But yeah.
Oh gosh, can I pass on recommendations this week? Because last week I mentioned in passing, and maybe this is I can make this my recommendation. The Netflix documentary on the college admissions scandal, because it goes to a lot of what we were just talking about. In terms of how colleges operate and take advantage of people, both students and parents. And it's really, like I said, it's shocking. It's like, I mean, it'll make you incredibly angry. And it's and the other thing, this was something I was going to recommend a while ago. Oh gosh, no, I'm forgetting the name of the actual. I'll tell you what. That will just be my recommendation for this week is the college admission scandal program.
Okay.
I'll hit you up with another one next time.
Sounds good. And, before we go, I should point out that, as usual, there were some things that we didn't get a chance to talk about this week that we will be talking about on our bonus show. For instance, vaccine passports. It's been a big deal recently. We'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about a pretty interesting case that was just decided by the Sixth Circuit here in our general area, right here in my backyard. Literally, I can't exactly throw a stone and hit the courthouse, but I could certainly drive there in a couple minutes, about the use of I guess you could say someone's preferred pronoun in a college classroom setting and whether or not that creates a hostile environment. Pretty interesting case there. That and maybe some a few listener questions if we have the opportunity to get to those. And if you are a Patreon supporter, that will be in your feed Wednesday morning. And if you're not, you can be one by just going to patreon.com/politicsguys. And again, if you'd like to get that and you cannot afford to be a supporter, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make that happen. One thing that doesn't cost you anything that really helps us out is if you could subscribe to the show, leave ratings and reviews, and especially if you could share episodes on social media or however you share stuff. That's a big help. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, we're at mail@politicsguys.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and you'll find links in our show notes. And a special thanks to our executive producers, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Chris Wilkerson, and Nathan Sosnowski. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.